I ran to the hospital to see my husband in intensive care. Suddenly, a nurse whispered, "Hide, now, trust me." She pushed me into the adjacent room. Through the crack in the door, I watched a woman enter. What I heard them say made my blood run cold. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Let me tell you how a 5-year marriage, a multi-million-dollar empire, and everything I thought I knew about my life came crashing down in a single afternoon. But first, let me take you back to where this nightmare began. My name is Margaret Thompson, though everyone calls me Maggie. At 64, I've built something most people only dream of, a real estate empire worth $37 million. Not bad for a girl from small-town Wyoming who started with nothing but determination and a talent for seeing potential where others saw problems. I was rushing through Denver General's sterile corridors that Tuesday afternoon, my heels clicking against the polished floors like a countdown to disaster. Richard had been in the ICU for 3 days, following what the doctors called a severe cardiac episode. 3 days of watching my husband of 5 years fighting for his life, or so I thought. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd built my fortune renovating broken-down buildings, while my own marriage was apparently beyond repair. Though at that moment, hurrying toward room 314, I still believed I was the devoted wife racing to her beloved husband's bedside. "Mrs. Thompson?" A young nurse with tired eyes and pulled-back brown hair stepped into my path. Her badge read, "Sarah Collins, RN. I need to speak with you privately." "Is Richard worse?" My heart hammered against my ribs. "The doctor said he was stable this morning." Sarah glanced around nervously, then grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Hide, now. Trust me." Before I could protest, she pushed me into the supply room adjacent to Richard's ICU room. Through the crack in the door, I watched a stunning young woman glide into my husband's room. She had honey blonde hair, perfect makeup despite it being 3 in the afternoon, and legs that went on for miles. She was wearing a red dress that cost more than most people's rent. Trust me, I know expensive when I see it. The woman approached Richard's bed with the confidence of someone who belonged there. That's when I heard my supposedly unconscious husband speak in a voice clearer than he'd managed in days. "Sophia, darling, you shouldn't be here during visiting hours." My world tilted sideways. Sophia? Who the hell was Sophia? I couldn't wait any longer, she purred, her voice carrying that breathy quality that usually made me want to roll my eyes. The lawyers confirmed everything. Once the transfer papers are signed, all her assets will be in your name only. I gripped the doorframe so hard I thought it might snap. "And the hospital records?" Richard asked, sounding nothing like a man who'd nearly died. "Perfect. Dr. Martinez was very accommodating once we explained the situation. Your recovery will be miraculous, but will require extended care. Maggie will be so focused on taking care of you, she won't notice the business transfers until it's too late." My husband chuckled. Actually chuckled. $37 million, and she'll hand it over gladly to make sure I get the best care. "What about the prenup?" Sophia asked. "What prenup?" Richard's voice was smug. "I made sure we never signed one. Too romantic," I told her. "True love doesn't need legal protection." I remembered that conversation from 5 years ago. I'd been the one to suggest a prenup, actually. I'd already had several profitable properties and wanted to protect my assets. But Richard had looked so hurt, so wounded by the suggestion, that I'd dropped it. "True love," he'd said, just like he was telling her now. "So once you're recovered," Sophia continued, "you'll have access to everything?" "Everything. The properties, the business accounts, the investment portfolio. And with her signature on the medical proxy forms, I can make decisions about her care when she inevitably has her own accident." The blood in my veins turned to ice water. "An accident?" Sophia's voice held just a hint of concern. Nothing dramatic, but wives who've lost their fortunes to medical expenses often become depressed, suicidal even. "Very sad, really. They were planning to kill me." I pressed my hand to my mouth to keep from making a sound. 5 years of marriage, and this man was casually discussing my murder with his 20-something mistress. "When do we move forward?" Sophia asked. "Next week. She's already signed the initial medical forms giving me financial authority during my recovery. The lawyer will bring the business transfer documents Thursday. Once those are signed, we wait 3 months for everything to process. Then, He made a sound that I can only describe as gleeful. "I can't wait to get out of this dreary city," Sophia said. "The house in Malibu will be perfect for us." My house in Malibu. The one I'd bought as a surprise for our 5th anniversary. Sarah Collins appeared beside me so quietly, I nearly jumped out of my skin. She put a finger to her lips and gestured for me to follow her. We slipped out through a back corridor I didn't know existed. Sarah led me to a break room at the end of the hall and locked the door behind us. "I'm so sorry you had to hear that," she said softly. I sank into a plastic chair, my legs suddenly unable to support me. "How long have you known?" 2 weeks. I've been his nurse since he was admitted, and that woman has been here every day. At first, I thought she was a daughter or something, but then I started noticing things." "What things?" "The way they touched each other, the conversations they had when they thought no one was listening. And yesterday, I accidentally saw some documents she brought, legal papers with your name on them." I looked at this young nurse, really looked at her for the first time. She had kind eyes but tired lines around them that spoke of someone who'd seen too much hardship for her age. "Why are you helping me?" I asked. Sarah hesitated. "Because I know what it's like to be betrayed by someone you trust. And because," she paused, seeming to weigh her words, "because I have a son, and if something happened to me, I'd want someone to look out for him. This is wrong, Mrs. Thompson. What they're planning? It's evil." We sat in silence for a moment while I tried to process everything I'd heard. "What do you think I should do?" I finally asked. Sarah smiled, and for the first time since I'd entered the hospital, I felt like someone was actually on my side. "I think," she said slowly, "that your husband and his girlfriend are about to discover that they've underestimated the wrong woman." I drove home in a daze, Sarah's words echoing in my mind. The woman they thought they were dealing with was the grieving wife who'd spent 3 days crying over her husband's bedside. But that woman had died in that supply room. The woman driving through Denver's afternoon traffic was someone else entirely, someone considerably more dangerous. My house sat on 3 acres in Cherry Hills Village, the kind of property that made real estate agents weep with joy. I'd bought it 15 years ago when it was a dated 1970s ranch and turned it into something that belonged in Architectural Digest. Richard always took credit for the vision, naturally, but every detail, from the imported marble to the custom lighting, had been my idea. Walking through my front door, I looked at everything differently now. This wasn't our home. It was mine. My money, my vision, my work. Richard had contributed exactly nothing except the occasional opinion and his signature on documents I'd put in front of him. I poured myself 3 fingers of the 18-year-old Macallan Richard, saved for special occasions. This felt pretty special to me. My phone buzzed. A text from Richard. "Feeling a bit better today. Doctor says you shouldn't worry about visiting tonight. Rest up, darling. Love you." "Love you too," I texted back, then muttered to my empty kitchen, "You lying, cheating, murderous bastard." The whiskey burned, but not nearly as much as the betrayal. I spent the next hour walking through my house, cataloging everything Richard might have access to. The good news was that most of my assets were in my name only. Legacy of my paranoid early days in business. The bad news was that Colorado was a common property state, and 5 years of marriage meant he had legitimate claims to quite a lot, but only if I died intestate. And only if I didn't fight back. I pulled out my laptop and started researching. If Richard thought he was dealing with some naive housewife, he was about to get educated. I didn't build a $37 million empire by being stupid or trusting. First stop, Margaret Winters, the divorce attorney who'd helped my friend Helen take her cheating ex-husband to the cleaners 2 years ago. Margaret had a reputation for being ruthless, expensive, and worth every penny. "Mrs. Thompson," Margaret's secretary said when I called, "I'm afraid Margaret is booked solid this week. Tell her it's an emergency consultation regarding a case worth $37 million. If she can see me tonight, I'll pay her double her usual rate." 5 minutes later, I had an appointment for 8 o'clock. Next, I called my accountant, James Morrison. James had been handling my books for 12 years and knew where every penny was invested. "James, I need you to freeze all joint accounts immediately and transfer everything to accounts Richard doesn't have access to." "Maggie, what's going on? Is everything all right?" "Let's just say I'm about to get divorced and I want to make sure I keep what's mine." I'll need documentation for something that dramatic. You'll have it by tomorrow. For now, just freeze everything. Richard's in the hospital and won't notice for a few days." There was a pause. "Consider it done." My third call was to Sarah Collins. I'd gotten her personal number before leaving the hospital. "I've been thinking about what you said," I told her, "about them underestimating me. I want to know exactly what they're planning and when. I can listen when they talk, but Mrs. Thompson, if they realize I'm helping you, they won't. And Sarah, when this is over, when I've dealt with them, I want to offer you something better than working in that hospital." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm about to have several properties that need managing, and I suspect I'm going to need someone I can trust completely." Another pause. "What kind of salary are we talking about?" I smiled, feeling like my old self for the first time in days. "The kind that means your son never has to worry about college tuition." By the time I left for my appointment with Margaret Winters, I had a plan forming. It wasn't complete yet, but it was a start. Richard and his little girlfriend thought they were going to steal my life. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Margaret Winters looked exactly like what you'd want in a divorce attorney. Sharp, well-dressed, and capable of cutting a man's assets in half with surgical precision. Her office was decorated in what I like to call intimidating success, all dark wood and legal diplomas. "Tell me everything," she said, after I'd explained the basics. I told her about the conversation I'd overheard, the fake medical crisis, the plan to transfer my assets. Margaret took notes in neat handwriting and asked pointed questions about my business structure and our financial arrangements. "The good news," she said when I finished, "is that they haven't actually done anything illegal yet. The bad news is that they're probably going to try very soon. How do we stop them? We get ahead of them, file for divorce before they can transfer anything, expose the medical fraud, and—" she smiled. "And it wasn't entirely pleasant. We make sure that when this is over, your husband wishes he'd never been born." I like the sound of that. "It won't be cheap, and it won't be quick. Are you prepared for a fight?" I thought about Richard's voice as he planned my murder, about Sophia talking about my house in Malibu like it was already hers, about 5 years of marriage that had apparently meant nothing to him. "Margaret," I said, "I've been building things and tearing them down for 40 years. I'm very prepared for a fight." We spent the next 2 hours planning my legal strategy. By the time I left her office, I felt like myself again. The woman who'd taken a small inheritance and turned it into an empire. The woman who'd never lost a business negotiation because she was always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Richard and Sophia were about to learn that they'd picked the wrong target. But first, I needed to know exactly what they were planning. And for that, I needed Sarah Collins to be my eyes and ears in that hospital room. What I discovered next would change everything I thought I knew about betrayal. The next morning, I woke up with the kind of clarity that comes after a good night's sleep and a solid plan for revenge. I'd always been a morning person, but today I felt particularly energetic. There's something invigorating about discovering your husband is trying to kill you and deciding to destroy him first. I dressed carefully, my navy Armani suit, the one that made me look like I could buy and sell anyone in the room. Because honestly, I probably could. The courthouse wouldn't open for 3 hours, but I wanted to be ready. My phone rang as I was finishing my coffee. Sarah Collins. "Mrs. Thompson, they moved up their timeline. Sophia is bringing the lawyer today at 2 o'clock. My blood chilled. "Today? You're sure? I heard them talking this morning. Richard seems nervous that you might get suspicious if he stays in the hospital much longer. He wants to sign everything and then have his miraculous recovery tomorrow." I checked my watch. It was 9:30. I had 4.5 hours to beat them to the punch. "Sarah, I need you to delay them somehow. Just for a few hours." "How am I supposed to do that?" "I don't know. Medical emergency, missing paperwork. You're a nurse. Be creative." There was a pause. "Mrs. Thompson, what if they find out I'm helping you?" "They won't. And even if they do, you'll be working for me by the end of the week. Just trust me." I hung up and called Margaret Winters. "We need to file the divorce papers this morning," I told her. "They're trying to transfer the assets today. I'll meet you at the courthouse in an hour. Everything's ready." Next, I called James Morrison. "I need you to document every asset transfer they've attempted and send it to my attorney immediately." "Already done." "And Maggie? You're going to want to see this. They tried to transfer the Cherry Hills house last week, but it failed because of the trust structure you set up in 2019. I'd forgotten about that trust. I'd created it for tax purposes, but apparently it was about to save my financial life. So they can't touch the house? Not without your signature on about 15 different documents. And even then, it would take months to process. For the first time in 24 hours, I smiled genuinely. James, remind me to give you a bonus. The Denver County Courthouse was exactly as intimidating as it was supposed to be, all marble columns and serious faces. Margaret met me at the entrance with a briefcase full of documents and the expression of a woman who lived for moments like this. Ready to ruin your husband's day? She asked. I've been ready for 5 years. I just didn't know it. Filing for divorce turns out to be remarkably anticlimactic. A lot of paperwork, some official stamps, and suddenly, you're legally separated from someone you've shared a bed with for 5 years. The court clerk, a middle-aged woman with sympathetic eyes, processed everything with professional efficiency. These will be served this afternoon, Margaret told me as we walked back to our cars. Your husband won't be able to transfer any assets after that without court approval. What about the medical fraud? I've contacted the district attorney's office. They're very interested in hearing about a fake medical emergency being used to commit financial fraud. We were interrupted by my phone ringing. Sarah Collins, sounding panicked. Mrs. Thompson, they're here early. The lawyer arrived at noon, and they're in Richard's room right now. What kind of papers do they have? I couldn't see clearly, but it's a thick stack. And Mrs. Thompson? Richard is out of bed, walking around. He's not even pretending to be sick anymore. I felt a surge of fury so strong it nearly knocked me over. Sarah, I need you to do something for me. Can you get close enough to take photos of the documents? I think so. But what if they catch me? They won't. And Sarah, whatever happens, you keep yourself safe. Don't take any risks. After hanging up, I turned to Margaret. They're signing the papers right now. Then it's a good thing we filed first. Those documents will be invalid the moment they're served with the divorce papers. When will that happen? Margaret checked her watch. The process server should be at the hospital within the hour. I spent the next 45 minutes pacing in the courthouse parking lot, checking my phone every 30 seconds. When it finally rang, I nearly dropped it. Mrs. Thompson? An unfamiliar male voice. This is Tom Bradley. I'm the process server. I just delivered the divorce documents to your husband at Denver General Hospital. How did he react? Tom chuckled. Well, ma'am, I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone turn that particular shade of purple before. He started screaming about some woman named Sophia, and how this was going to ruin everything. Was there a young blonde woman in the room? Yes. Ma'am, she went white as a sheet and ran out of there like her hair was on fire, left behind a whole stack of legal documents, too. I felt a satisfaction so deep it was almost spiritual. Thank you, Tom. You've made my day. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. You need to see this. Coming to meet you. Richard is losing his mind. 20 minutes later, Sarah walked into the coffee shop across from the courthouse, looking like she'd just witnessed a car accident. She slid into the booth across from me and pulled out her phone. I got photos of the documents before Sophia dropped them, she said, showing me her screen. Mrs. Thompson, they weren't just trying to steal your money. I looked at the images she'd captured. Legal documents transferring ownership of my properties. Business incorporation papers for something called Thompson Holdings, with Richard and Sophia as the only officers. And at the bottom of the stack, something that made my blood run cold. A will. My will, apparently, leaving everything to my beloved husband Richard in the event of my tragic suicide due to overwhelming grief. They had already written my suicide note, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Sarah nodded grimly. And Mrs. Thompson? I overheard them talking about the timeline. They were planning to complete their plan this weekend. This weekend. They were going to kill me this weekend. I stared at the photos of my forged signature on documents I'd never seen, at the suicide note written in handwriting that wasn't mine, but was close enough to fool anyone who didn't know me well. Sarah, I said finally, I think it's time we called the police. But as I reached for my phone, it rang again, Richard's name on the screen. Hello, darling, I answered, my voice sweet as honey. You bitch, he snarled. You conniving, suspicious bitch. Do you have any idea what you've done? I have some idea, I replied calmly. Though I'm curious to hear your perspective. 5 years of marriage, and this is how you repay me? Having me served with divorce papers while I'm fighting for my life in the hospital? Fighting for your life? Richard, honey, I saw you walking around that room this afternoon. Unless cardiac patients have made remarkable medical advances in the last 24 hours. The silence on the other end was deafening. Oh, Richard, I added sweetly, you might want to let Sophia know that forging someone's signature is a federal crime. The FBI takes that very seriously. I hung up and turned to Sarah, who was staring at me with something approaching awe. What happens now? She asked. Now, I said, we make sure they pay for what they tried to do. And then we build something better from the ashes of their stupidity. But I was about to discover that Richard and Sophia had one more surprise waiting for me. And this one would change everything. The police detective assigned to my case was a woman named Elena Rodriguez, a no-nonsense professional in her 40s who looked like she'd seen every kind of human stupidity and wasn't impressed by any of it. We met at the downtown precinct Thursday morning, and I brought everything. The photos of the forged documents, recordings of Richard's threatening phone calls, and a detailed timeline of their fraud. Mrs. Thompson, Detective Rodriguez said after reviewing everything, this is one of the more elaborate financial fraud schemes I've seen. The fake medical emergency, the forged documents, the planned murder disguised as suicide. Your husband and his girlfriend weren't planning a simple theft. They were planning the perfect crime. How close did they come to pulling it off? Closer than you want to know. If you hadn't overheard that conversation, if you hadn't filed for divorce when you did, she shrugged. Let's just say we'd probably be investigating your death instead of their crimes. The thought sent a chill down my spine. What happens next? We arrest them. The evidence you've provided is more than sufficient for charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit murder. Your husband will be taken into custody this afternoon. I should have felt victorious, but mostly I felt hollow. 5 years of marriage, and it had come to this. My phone rang as I was leaving the police station. Sarah Collins. Mrs. Thompson, I have news. Good news, I think. I could use some good news. The hospital administration is conducting a full investigation into Richard's fake medical records. They're also reviewing Dr. Martinez's involvement. And, she paused, they've offered me a promotion to head nurse in the cardiac unit. Sarah, that's wonderful. It gets better. Because I was the one who exposed the fraud, they're giving me a commendation and a significant raise. But Mrs. Thompson, I still want to take that job you offered. Managing your properties sounds a lot more interesting than hospital politics. I smiled for what felt like the first time in days. Consider it yours. We'll start with the Denver properties and see how it goes. That afternoon, I watched from my living room window as 2 police cars pulled into my driveway. They weren't there for me. They were there to search for evidence of Richard's crimes. Detective Rodriguez had obtained a warrant to seize any documents related to the fraud scheme. It was surreal, watching strangers catalog the contents of my home office, bagging documents, and photographing everything. This was the office where Richard and I used to plan our investments, where we'd dreamed about retirement, where I'd built my empire one property at a time. Now it was a crime scene. Mrs. Thompson? Detective Rodriguez emerged from the office carrying a laptop I'd never seen before. We found this hidden in your husband's desk. It contains some interesting correspondence. She showed me the screen. Emails between Richard and Sophia dating back 18 months. Long before his medical emergency. Long before I had any suspicion that my marriage was falling apart. The emails told a story that was somehow worse than I'd imagined. They weren't just planning to steal my money. They'd been plotting to destroy my life systematically. Richard had been sharing confidential information about my business deals, helping Sophia understand the best ways to attack my assets. They'd researched my daily routines, my favorite restaurants, even my medical history. They've been planning this for 1.5 years, I said, scrolling through message after message. At least? And Mrs. Thompson? There's something else you need to see. She pulled up a folder labeled Insurance Policies. Inside were documents I'd never seen before. Life insurance policies on me, taken out 6 months ago, with Richard as the sole beneficiary. 3 different policies from 3 different companies, totaling $12 million. I never signed these, I said, examining the signatures. They were forgeries, but good ones. We figured as much. Your husband was very thorough in planning your murder. That evening, I sat alone in my house, really alone for the first time in 5 years, and tried to process everything that had happened. Richard was in jail awaiting arraignment. Sophia had been arrested at her apartment, where police found additional forged documents and cash that Richard had apparently been embezzling from our joint accounts for months. My marriage was over. My trust in other people was severely damaged. But surprisingly, I wasn't devastated. I was angry, furious actually. And there's nothing more dangerous than a rich woman with good lawyers and a desire for revenge. My phone rang. Margaret Winters. "I have news about the asset investigation," she said. "It's worse than we thought, but also better." "How can it be both?" "It's worse because Richard has been systematically stealing from you for 2 years. Small amounts that wouldn't trigger any alerts, but it adds up to nearly $400,000. My jaw dropped. 400,000? But it's better because we can trace every penny. And because he did it electronically, we have perfect documentation. He's going to prison for a very long time. What about Sophia? She's facing charges for conspiracy, fraud, and identity theft. The forged signatures alone will get her 5 to 10 years. After hanging up, I poured myself another glass of the Macallan and walked out onto my deck. The October evening was crisp, and I could see the lights of Denver sprawling below my property. Somewhere out there, Richard was sitting in a jail cell, probably still trying to figure out how his perfect crime had fallen apart so quickly. I thought about Sarah Collins, who'd risked her career to help a stranger because it was the right thing to do. I thought about Margaret Winters, who'd dropped everything to help me fight back. I thought about Detective Rodriguez, who'd treated this case with the seriousness it deserved. Good people, honest people, people I could trust. Maybe losing Richard wasn't the disaster I'd thought it was. Maybe it was an opportunity to build something better. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This isn't over, bitch. I'll make you pay for this." Sophia, apparently, was out on bail and feeling communicative. I smiled and forwarded the message to Detective Rodriguez. Then I typed back, "Looking forward to it. By the way, threatening a witness is another felony. See you in court." 3 minutes later, my phone rang. Detective Rodriguez. "Mrs. Thompson, we'll have officers at your house within 10 minutes, and I'm putting a rush on revoking Sophia's bail." "Thank you, Detective. Thank you for forwarding that message. Some criminals just can't help making our jobs easier." As I waited for the police to arrive, I realized something important. For the first time in 5 years, I was making decisions based on what I wanted, not what would make Richard happy, or keep the peace, or maintain some facade of marital harmony. And what I wanted was justice. Complete, thorough, devastating justice. They'd picked the wrong woman to cross. And they were about to find out exactly how expensive that mistake was going to be. 6 months later, I stood in the courthouse watching my husband of 5 years get sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Richard had aged considerably since his arrest. The silver hair had gone completely white. And the confident businessman I'd married had been replaced by a man who looked small and defeated in his orange jumpsuit. Sophia got 8 years, and watching her led away in handcuffs felt better than I care to admit. The young woman who'd thought she could steal my life was about to discover what life behind bars was really like. But the real satisfaction came from what I'd built in the aftermath of their attempted destruction. Thompson Properties has acquired 16 new buildings in the last 6 months, Sarah Collins reported during our weekly meeting. She'd taken to property management like she was born for it, and her hospital experience had given her excellent skills in dealing with difficult people and complex logistics. 16? I raised an eyebrow. I thought we were being conservative. Sarah grinned. She'd changed considerably since leaving the hospital. Gone were the tired scrubs and exhausted expression, replaced by sharp business attire and the confidence that came from being very good at something you loved. We were conservative, but when word got out that Richard Thompson was a fraud who'd been embezzling from his wife's business, 3 of his former clients came to us with properties they'd been planning to sell to him. Turns out he'd been making promises he couldn't keep. And the property values? Below market. Everyone. They just wanted to get rid of them quickly and quietly. We got the entire Harbor District portfolio for 60% of its assessed value. I smiled. Richard's criminal behavior had actually been good for business. His former clients were so desperate to distance themselves from the scandal that they were practically giving properties away. "What about the Malibu house?" I asked. "Sold yesterday. Final price was $3.8 million, which was $400,000 above asking price. Apparently, houses with infamous histories sell well in California. The house I'd bought as an anniversary gift and they'd planned to live in after my murder was now funding my expansion into the California market." There was something poetic about that. "Any word from our mutual friend in prison?" Sarah's expression darkened. "Richard called my office yesterday. Collect call from the federal penitentiary. He wanted to know if I'd consider visiting him." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that threatening to kill my employer's wife tends to make me uninterested in social visits. Over the past 6 months, I'd discovered something interesting about myself. I was much better at business when I wasn't constantly worried about someone else's feelings. Without Richard questioning every decision, second-guessing every investment, and taking credit for every success, my productivity had tripled. The divorce had been finalized 3 months ago. Margaret Winters had been ruthless in protecting my assets, and the prenup Richard had talked me out of signing 5 years ago might have actually worked in his favor. Instead, the criminal charges and documented fraud meant he left the marriage with exactly nothing. Less than nothing, actually, since he still owed $400,000 in restitution. "Mrs. Thompson?" Sarah's assistant, David, knocked on my office door. "Detective Rodriguez is here to see you." Elena Rodriguez had become something like a friend over the past months. She'd kept me informed about the case proceedings and had been instrumental in helping me understand the full scope of Richard and Sophia's crimes. "Elena," I said, standing to greet her, "please tell me you have good news." "I have great news. We found the rest of the money." For months, investigators had been tracking down assets that Richard had hidden in various accounts. The $400,000 we documented was just the beginning. "How much more?" $800,000. Hidden in cryptocurrency accounts and offshore banking. Richard was more sophisticated than we initially realized. I sat down heavily. "So he stole over $1 million from me?" "Over the course of 3 years, yes. But Mrs. Thompson, it gets better. All of it has been recovered and is being returned to you with interest." The irony was staggering. Richard's theft had actually resulted in a net gain for me once the interest and recovered investments were calculated. "There's something else," Elena continued. "Sophia's been trying to make a deal with the prosecutor." "What kind of deal?" "She claims Richard was planning to kill her too, once the insurance money was collected and the assets were transferred. She says she has evidence that he'd already started researching her accidental death." I felt a chill. "Do you believe her?" "Actually, yes. We found searches on his computer for untraceable poisons and ways to stage accidental drownings. Sophia may have thought she was his partner, but she was probably just another victim in a longer-term plan." That evening, I sat in my home office, the same office where Richard had planned my murder, and reviewed everything that had happened over the past year. The financial statements alone told an incredible story. Thompson Properties was now worth $48 million, an increase of over 30% since the divorce. Removing Richard from the business had been like removing a tumor. Everything functioned better without his interference. My phone rang, an international number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Thompson?" An unfamiliar female voice with a slight accent. "My name is Catherine Walsh. I'm calling from London. How can I help you?" "Catherine, I saw the news coverage of your husband's case, the financial fraud, the attempted murder. I'm calling because I think Richard Thompson tried to kill my sister 15 years ago." The room went completely silent, except for the sound of my own heartbeat. "I'm sorry, what?" "My sister Emma was married to a man named Richard Thompson in Phoenix in 2009. He was a financial advisor then. She died in what was ruled a suicide, but the family never believed it. And when I saw your husband's photo in the news," my hands started shaking. "Catherine, are you saying my husband was married before?" "I'm saying he murdered my sister for her inheritance and got away with it. And if you hadn't caught him, you would have been next." I gripped the phone so tightly I thought it might crack. "How do you know it was the same Richard Thompson?" "Because I've been tracking him for 15 years. The photo in the Denver Post is definitely him. He looks older, but it's him." "Mrs. Thompson, your husband is a serial killer." The conversation continued for another hour. Catherine Walsh painted a picture of Richard as a methodical predator who targeted wealthy women, married them quickly, and then killed them for their assets. Emma Walsh had been his first known victim, but Catherine suspected there were others. I've hired private investigators over the years, but he was always too careful, too clever. Until now. What changed? You caught him. You survived. And now we have evidence, documentation, proof of his methods. Mrs. Thompson, would you be willing to help me get justice for my sister? I looked around my office, at the business I'd built, at the life I'd reclaimed from the ashes of Richard's betrayal. Catherine, I said, I'd be honored to help you destroy him. What I discovered about Richard's past would change everything I thought I knew about the man I'd married, and it would lead to one final confrontation that would determine whether justice was truly served. The investigation into Richard's past took 3 months and revealed a pattern of predatory behavior spanning 20 years. Catherine Walsh had been right. Emma Thompson, née Walsh, had been his first victim, but she wasn't his last. Detective Rodriguez coordinated with law enforcement agencies across 5 states, and what they discovered was chilling. Richard had used different names, different backgrounds, different stories, but the pattern was always the same. Find a successful, wealthy woman, marry her quickly, gain access to her assets, and then kill her in a way that looked like suicide or accident. We've identified 6 victims over 20 years, Elena told me during our meeting at the district attorney's office. Emma Walsh in Phoenix in 2009, Linda Martinez in San Antonio in 2011, Carol Stevens in Austin in 2013, Jennifer Burke in Oklahoma City in 2016, Michelle Davis in Kansas City in 2018, and you were supposed to be number 7 in Denver in 2024. I stared at the photos of the women spread across the conference table. They all looked successful, confident, happy in their final photos. They all looked like me. How did he get away with it for so long? He was smart. He never stayed in the same state twice. He changed his approach slightly each time, learned from any mistakes, and he was patient. He'd take years to research potential targets before making contact. Research? Elena pulled out a thick file. We found his planning documents hidden in a storage unit. He'd been tracking you for 5 years before you ever met him. Studying your business patterns, your social life, your routines. He knew more about you than most of your friends did. The thought was nauseating. 5 years of being watched, studied, analyzed like a business acquisition. How did he choose his targets? Successful women in their 50s or 60s, usually divorced or widowed, always with substantial assets and limited family ties. Women who were lonely enough to fall for a charming man, but too proud to admit they needed help. That described me perfectly when I'd met Richard 5 years ago. I'd been 59, recently divorced from my first husband, building my real estate empire but feeling isolated and lonely. Richard had seemed like a miracle, a successful businessman who shared my interests and supported my ambitions. Now I realized he'd been playing a role, becoming exactly what I needed him to be. What happens next? The families of his other victims are pressing for reopened investigations. With the evidence we've gathered from your case, we can build murder charges for at least 3 of the previous deaths. Will that be enough to keep him in prison? Elena smiled grimly. Mrs. Thompson, if we can prove even 1 additional murder, your ex-husband will never see the outside of a prison cell again. That afternoon, I met with Catherine Walsh, who had flown in from London to coordinate the investigation. She was a successful attorney in her 50s, with the same determined expression I'd seen in my own mirror. "Thank you for doing this," she said over coffee. Emma was my older sister, my best friend. She was brilliant, successful, and she deserved so much better than what he did to her. What was she like? Catherine smiled sadly. She was a lot like you, actually. Strong, independent, built her own business from nothing. She was an architect, specialized in sustainable housing. She would have loved what you've done with your properties. We spent 2 hours going through Emma's case file. The parallels to my own experience were frightening. The whirlwind romance, the quick marriage, the gradual isolation from friends and family, and finally the suicide that left Richard as the sole heir to her estate. The difference, Catherine said, is that Emma trusted him completely. She never suspected anything until it was too late. How do you know? Because she called me the night before she died. She said Richard had been acting strange, pressuring her to sign some documents, and she was thinking about getting a second opinion from a lawyer. She never got the chance. That evening, I received a call that changed everything. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Lieutenant Sarah Morrison with the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Your ex-husband would like to meet with you. Richard wants to see me. He's claiming he has information about additional crimes that he's willing to share, but only with you." I was quiet for a long moment. "What kind of information?" "He won't say. But Mrs. Thompson, you should know that he's been placed in protective custody. Apparently, word has gotten around about his crimes, and inmates don't take kindly to men who murder women." 2 days later, I found myself sitting across from Richard Thompson in a federal prison visiting room. He looked terrible, thin, pale, and nervous in a way I'd never seen before. The confident man who'd tried to kill me had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely afraid. "Hello, Maggie," he said quietly. "Richard." We stared at each other across the metal table for a long moment. "I suppose you're here to gloat," he said finally. "Actually, I'm here because you said you had information about other crimes." His expression shifted, became more calculating. "I do, but I want something in exchange. You're not in a position to negotiate." "I think I am. The information I have could solve several cold cases and bring closure to multiple families. That has to be worth something." I leaned forward. "What do you want?" "A transfer to a minimum security facility, better protection from the other inmates. And," he hesitated, "I want you to know that I never meant for it to go as far as it did with you." The audacity was breathtaking. "You planned to murder me for my money, Richard. How much further could it go? I mean, I never planned to hurt you personally. It wasn't personal. You planned my suicide note. You researched untraceable poisons. How was that not personal?" He looked uncomfortable. "The others were different." "You were different. I actually cared about you. Enough to kill me for $37 million. Enough to feel bad about it afterward." The conversation was surreal. My ex-husband, the serial killer, was trying to convince me that attempted murder was somehow a sign of affection. "Tell me about the other women," I said. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. How you chose them, how you killed them, where the bodies are buried." For the next 2 hours, Richard confessed to details that would solve 6 murders spanning 15 years. He was matter-of-fact about it, describing his crimes like they were business transactions, which I suppose to him they were. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked finally. "Because I'm never getting out of here anyway, and because—" He paused, looking genuinely remorseful for the first time. "Because maybe if I help solve these cases, it will mean something. Maybe it will count for something. It won't bring back the women you killed. No, but it might give their families answers." I stood to leave, then turned back. "Richard, did you ever love me? Even a little?" He was quiet for a long time. "I don't think I'm capable of love." "Maggie, I think that's the problem." Walking out of that prison, I felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. Not forgiveness, never that. But pity for a man who was so fundamentally broken that he could only connect with other people by destroying them. 3 weeks later, the additional murder charges were filed. Richard pleaded guilty to 6 counts of first-degree murder in exchange for life in prison without the possibility of parole. Catherine Walsh called me the day the plea was finalized. "It's over," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "After 15 years, Emma finally has justice." "How do you feel?" "Exhausted, relieved, grateful, and angry that it took so long." "I understand. Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that what you did, catching him, stopping him, it saved other women's lives. He would have kept killing if you hadn't been strong enough to fight back." 6 months after Richard's sentencing, I stood in the conference room of Thompson Properties, looking out at the Denver skyline. The company now employed 47 people and managed properties worth $83 million. Sarah Collins knocked on my door. "Mrs. Thompson, the new acquisitions team is here for the meeting." I'd been expanding rapidly, and not just in Denver. We now had offices in Phoenix, Austin, and Oklahoma City, the same cities where Richard had murdered women over the past decades. In each location, I'd partnered with organizations that supported women who were rebuilding their lives after trauma. "And Sarah? I've told you 100 times, call me Maggie." She smiled. "Maggie? There's something else. My son Jake wants to thank you personally for his college fund. Jake Collins was now 15 and had been accepted into an advanced engineering program that would lead directly to MIT. The college fund I'd established for him was part of a larger foundation I'd created to help the children of Richard's victims. Tell Jake he's earned it with his grades. I will. And Maggie, thank you for everything. That evening, I sat on my deck with a glass of wine, watching the sunset over the mountains. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Rodriguez. Richard Thompson died in prison today. Apparent heart attack. Thought you should know. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to figure out how I felt. Relief, mostly, and a strange sense of closure. Richard was gone. The women he'd killed finally had justice. The families he'd destroyed had answers. And I had built something meaningful from the ashes of his attempted destruction. My phone rang. Catherine Walsh from London. I heard the news, she said simply. How are you feeling? Like I can finally stop looking over my shoulder. Like Emma can finally rest. What will you do now? Live, I think. Really live, for the first time in 15 years. After hanging up, I walked through my house, in my name, bought with my money, decorated with my choices. For the first time in 5 years, every decision in my life was mine alone. It was terrifying and exhilarating and absolutely perfect. I'd survived a serial killer's attempt to murder me, rebuilt my life, expanded my business, and helped bring justice to 6 murdered women. At 64, I was more successful, more confident, and more authentically myself than I'd ever been. Richard had tried to steal my life, but instead, he'd helped me find it. And now, as I watched the lights of Denver twinkle below, I realized that the best revenge wasn't just surviving his betrayal, it was thriving in spite of it. He'd bet everything on my death, I'd bet everything on my life, and I'd won. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.